The city coughed rain when I tripped over a dead woman and landed in a puddle that felt like a cold hand closing around my ankle. For 3 heartbeats I believed she was about to sit up and scold me. By the 4th I understood she would never speak again, and that whatever had silenced her was still nearby and listening. I was there for a story that had nothing to do with death. A city councilman had promised to meet me behind the noodle shop to trade gossip for anonymity, and maybe a mention of his charity work. The alley ran between rusted fire escapes and dumpsters slick with neon reflections. I muttered about my ruined shoes and fished for my phone, then my knee knocked against the woman. Her face tilted toward the dim streetlight with the resigned patience of a portrait that had already posed too long. She looked 30 at most and far too tidy for an alley. Dark hair pinned back. A tailored coat that had not lost a button. A smear of rain on one cheek like a tear that the sky insisted on finishing for her. I wanted it to be a drunk who would wake up swearing at me. I wanted her to groan so I could become a hero who called an ambulance. Her skin was cool and oddly perfumed. There was sandalwood and something familiar from my late-night takeout habit. Soy and sugar maybe. I checked the wrists for bruises. None. I checked the purse that rested beside her, as if its owner had set it down while hunting keys. Nothing missing so far as I could tell. The zipper pull glinted. Her right hand was clenched, nails neat and pale, knuckles tight. I pried gently and found a paper crane folded from rice paper, soft from the rain but stubborn as if it had a spine. When I shook it out, it held together with the pride of a tiny monument. Sirens arrived in the cautious way they do in neighborhoods that keep secrets. 2 uniforms crouched beside me and traded the blunt questions. Name. Occupation. What are you doing here? I said journalist, and they exchanged a look that meant we will have to hear you talk too much. They taped the alley, took my soggy statement, and decided the night would be simpler if it became a mugging gone wrong. I felt the stubborn weight of the crane in my pocket, and decided not to mention it yet. Sometimes the only thing between truth and a lazy headline is a pocket. A plainclothes detective with a haircut like a bark order examined the scene with impatient eyes. He found no wallet on the victim, but her phone sat beside the purse as if waiting for a call that never came. No defensive wounds. No obvious trauma. One of the uniforms guessed poison with the expertise of a man who watches many crime shows. The detective grunted. The rain softened. From the street, a car door thudded and a man moved into the mouth of the alley like a shadow that had learned manners. He was not tall, not short, not anything you could remember if you had known him for 10 minutes. He wore a dark suit that did not try to be important and a simple wedding band that had known the habit of a hand. He spoke to the detective in a voice that asked nothing and promised nothing. He said his name was Takashi Kuroda. He said the woman was his wife Elena. He did not ask, "Can I see her?" He did not demand who did this. He stood beside her with a stillness that made the rain change its mind and fall elsewhere. Grief comes in many languages. Some howl. Some bargain. Some hold still because they learned long ago that stillness can be a shield. I watched him watch her. He adjusted her hair with 2 fingers, so careful that the gesture felt like prayer. "Thank you for handling her with care," he told the detective. The words were correct, and the tone was even, and the eyes were a calm that belonged to someone who had filled a cup with rage and sealed the lid. A squad car idled at the curb, the red and blue lights skimming the brick. Takashi turned to go. It seemed too soon and exactly right. I followed because curiosity pays my rent and because silence is sometimes a louder scream than grief. "Excuse me," I said, trying not to slip again. I asked the default question any reporter asks when his brain is still catching up. "Is there anyone who would want to hurt her?" He looked at me and I learned that eyes can rest on your face without touching you. "People hurt each other for reasons that look reasonable only to them," he said. Then he added that he would answer questions another time. He thanked me for calling it in, though he had no proof I had. He moved away without haste. The rain accepted him, and he was gone. Cops grumble when a story refuses to sit down. I wandered back to the tape and pretended to be a helpful civilian. The detective finally waved me off. "Go home," he said, "we have this." I wanted to believe him. The alley had its own logic, though. The dumpsters were clean. Too clean for a back lane behind a popular noodle shop. The lids had the tidy white look of a fridge at an open house. On a hunch, I lifted one. Inside, bags lined up in obedient rows. The top one had a pattern of cranes. I told myself it was coincidence. The city is thick with patterns if you go looking. I let the lid fall and it clanged like a cheap lie. On the walk to my car I felt watched. That is cheap noir, I told myself, but the neck knows before the brain admits it. On rooftops the fire escapes stacked like ladders to nowhere. Somewhere a cat made a noise like a violinist with bad timing. The noodle shop door swung once then stilled. I looked back at the alley and the tape shone under the streetlight like a ribbon on a gift no one wants. Home is a studio apartment that once tried to be a bakery. The kitchen smells like memory and flour. I peeled off my wet shirt and draped it over a chair and stared at the crane on my counter. It had survived the pocket and the rain. The folded wings were precise, the creases crisp as if pressed under a book. I do not collect crafts, but I collect puzzles. I warmed my hands around a chipped mug and said to the crane, "All right then, what do you know?" Sleep did not come. It seldom does when a night is heavy with questions. Around 3 I phoned a contact at the coroner office and traded 2 stories I had not published yet for one detail I wanted. There were no signs of struggle. No needle marks. No blunt trauma. Possibly an agent absorbed through the skin. The voice hesitated when I asked if there was a scent. The text said sandalwood and something sweet and savory like the air over a grill. I remembered the noodle shop and my stomach tightened for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. I should have gone to a motel or a friend's place or anywhere that did not have my name on the mailbox, but exhaustion and stubbornness make a persuasive pair. I told myself I would write a draft, drink something hot, and sleep with the television on like the glow could keep trouble away. The apartment had the peace of a stage before the actors arrive. I locked the door, checked the windows, then checked them again. The cranes were back on the desk because pretending they were not part of my life had failed to convince anyone, least of all me. I brewed tea, sat down, and typed 3 sentences about a city that loves its myths. The 4th sentence began with the word ledger. I paused, frowning at the screen, because I did not remember deciding to type that. The first sound was soft, more suggestion than noise, a thread of air that did not belong to my apartment. The second sound was the curtain stirring when the window I had checked twice slid up as if it had remembered a promise to let the night in. A gloved hand found the sill, a second joined it, and a figure flowed through the gap like water wearing a mask. I froze, the way people freeze when the animal in the brush finally steps out where you can see its teeth. 2 more clustered in the darkness behind him. They moved with patience, not the jitter of amateurs. The first one tilted his head at me like a patient teacher. "Where is the ledger?" he asked, like it was a thing normal people kept in the cutlery drawer next to the bottle opener. I thought about lying with something theatrical. Something like I ate it. I thought about sprinting for the door. What I did was say I do not have it, because the truth had the advantage of being true and my courage had wandered off without leaving a note. The one by the window came closer and gestured at my desk. His fingertip touched the crane. He picked it up with a familiarity that made my mouth go dry. He asked again. "The ledger. Where?" He had the kind of voice you would follow into a basement without asking why there was no light. I told them I had never seen it, and that I was not important enough to be in possession of anything except rent and overdue laundry. The nearest one stepped behind me and began to wrap something around my wrists with the competence of a man who has tied many things that fought back. He smelled of metal and soap. The leader bent toward me and said that I had made many people curious, and that curiosity was a currency some people paid in blood. His eyes were the color of dusk. He reached for the second crane with 2 fingers like a priest touching a relic. He turned it over, then tucked it into his jacket. He asked for the last time. "The ledger." My answer was interrupted by the window shattering inward in a neat arc, as if the glass had been instructed to step aside. A shape arrived on the floor without the indignity of falling. For a heartbeat I did not understand what I was seeing. Then the shape stood up, and the room learned the definition of silence. Takashi did not announce himself. He moved like a decision already made. His hand closed around the wrist of the man behind me, and the wrap that had threatened to become a knot fell harmlessly to the carpet. The leader stepped back, knife glinting, a hiss of surprise escaping him like air from a cut tire. The other figure reached for his belt, and then folded to the floor with a noise like a dropped sack, something small and hard having tapped him behind the ear. I watched the next few seconds the way one watches a storm roll across open ground. Things happened quickly but with the clarity of a trained sequence. A palm redirected a knife as if it were a suggestion that could be declined. A foot placed itself where a throat planned to be. A shoulder turned and momentum belonged to the wrong body. Each move was almost polite, the kind of etiquette that ends in bruises and long naps. I found myself narrating in my head because that is what a reporter does when the mind cannot process the fact that someone has just removed 3 men from the category of threat with the economy of a dancer closing a show. When it was over, one of the intruders was snoring on my rug, one was trying to remember how to breathe without instruction, and one was hanging out my windowsill in a way that suggested he had rethought his career path. Takashi looked at the cranes on the desk, then at me, and the calm on his face was the same calm he had worn beside a coffin. He told me to get my shoes. He told me to bring nothing else. I asked if I could at least shut the window, because sometimes the brain grabs for normal things. He nodded and stepped lightly over the bodies, collecting what looked like a cable from the floor and dropping it into his pocket, as if tidying was as important as survival. We were in his car before my heart slowed down enough to make room for words. He drove without looking like he was driving. Holding the wheel seemed more like an agreement with physics than an action. He told me the men would be gone when we returned. He said there would be no prints, no proof, and no point bringing the police into a game they could not play. I asked the only question available to me, which came out ragged and obvious. What do they think I have? He said the ledger, like a teacher answering a student who had finally asked the right thing. He said it contained names and dates and sums that did not belong in daylight. He said Elena had found it. He said the night in the alley had not been random. We stopped at a warehouse that had the kind of anonymity people pay money for. Inside, an office had been converted into something that wanted to be a clinic. There was a kettle, a first aid kit, and a mat with the scuffs of practice fights. He poured tea like we were about to discuss the weather. He told me Elena had been an investigator whose cover did not admit the word investigator. He said she had been inside the group people around here called the Black Lotus, a network that made money out of secrets and fear. He said she had found proof that would end careers and start funerals. He said the ledger had gone missing the same week she died. I told him about Miyu and the bar and the way people kept appearing to give me half a truth then disappearing before I could pay the rest of the bill. At the name, something flickered across his face, quick as a fish turning in clear water. He said that some friends are less than that, and some enemies are more complicated. He told me not to meet anyone at Piers without telling him first. I told him I did not belong to him. He said that for the moment I did, because I had stepped onto a board where the pieces moved without asking permission, and he was the only one in the room who knew the game. I said that sounded arrogant. He said it sounded like survival. I asked why he had not told the police everything from the start. He said because the ledger held names that could pick up a phone and make evidence disappear, and because Elena had promised to bring it to him, not to them. He said she had trusted me once, in a small way that mattered to her, and that is why he had not let the men take me apart in my living room. I wanted to ask what that small way was, but the look in his eyes said the past was a place we would visit only when he invited me. The apology for my apartment came out of me then, awkward and small. He said walls can be replaced and rugs bought by the yard, but there are only so many chances to stop something before it spreads. He fixed me with a steady look and asked if I. Takashi Kuroda did not appear in my dreams, but the cranes did. They were everywhere, a flock of white paper drifting in slow motion through alleys and rooftops, their creases catching the moonlight. One landed on my palm and unfolded itself into a map I could not read before catching fire. I woke with my heart racing, the smell of smoke in my head and the sound of rain on the window. The city was going about its usual business of pretending nothing unusual ever happens, but my gut told me the previous night had opened a door I was not going to be able to close. My editor wanted a soft article about urban crime. I wanted to know why a man had sent me a folded threat, and why the scent of sandalwood kept turning up like punctuation. The funeral still lingered in my mind. There had been a precision to the way the mourners moved, a rhythm to their entrances and exits. They were not friends and family in the usual sense. They behaved more like a team that had trained together, people who did not need to speak to coordinate. I had tried to chalk it up to paranoia, but paranoia tends to grow legs when people start throwing darts at your head. It did not help that my phone had been unusually quiet since the ex-cop had vanished from the bar. I called the number he had used to text me the meeting place. Disconnected. I sent a message anyway, something vague about following up. No reply. I could have ignored it, but ignoring things is for people who like being safe, and safe was not what I was after. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to stop playing observer and see Takashi again. The address on the marriage license took me to a narrow row house in a part of the city where laundry swayed between buildings like flags of resignation. The curtains were drawn. The doorbell produced no sound. I waited until a neighbor emerged to take out trash. She was small and wiry, with sharp eyes that had seen enough to be unimpressed by most things. I asked if Mr. Kuroda was home. She said he traveled for work. Import-export. Sometimes gone for weeks. She said Elena was nice, always polite, but did not gossip. When I asked if she knew about the Cranes, she gave me a look that belonged in a much darker conversation, and went inside without another word. I was about to leave when I noticed a man across the street pretending to read a newspaper. He was the sort of person who looked like background noise, except he kept adjusting the pages without ever actually turning them. I started walking in the opposite direction. He folded the paper, stood, and followed at a comfortable distance. I led him toward a bus stop, ducked inside the shelter, then slipped out the back through a gap in the fence before the bus arrived. By the time I looped around to check if he was still there, the man was gone. The city has a way of making people vanish when it wants them gone. That night I received another message from an unknown number. It said, "Meet me tomorrow at the alley, noon. Bring the Cranes." It did not specify which alley, but I did not need to ask. I went early, figuring I could find a good vantage point. Noon came and went without anyone stepping into the rain-darkened lane. I was starting to think it had been a setup when a man in a hooded jacket approached. He did not look like Takashi. He looked like someone who knew Takashi. He asked if I wanted to know what really happened to Elena. I said yes. He told me to stop asking questions unless I wanted to be next. I asked what the Cranes meant. He said they meant someone had decided you were worth watching, and not in a good way. Before I could push further, a noise behind me made me turn. When I looked back, the man was gone. That evening I found myself at a small bar 2 neighborhoods over, the kind with low lights and a jukebox that only plays songs people regret. I was halfway through a beer when a woman slid onto the stool beside me. She was tall, with hair tied back and the sort of posture that tells you she is comfortable in dangerous places. She said her name was Miyu, and that she had known Elena. She said Elena had been working on something dangerous. She said the Cranes were a warning used by a group called the Black Lotus. The name matched what the ex-cop had told me before vanishing. I asked what they wanted. She said they wanted loyalty and obedience, and they did not mind killing to get both. She said Elena had something they needed and they killed her for it. I asked if she knew Takashi's part in this. She smiled in a way that told me I was circling a truth but not ready for it. She said Takashi was dangerous too, but for different reasons. Then she stood, left money on the bar, and walked out without looking back. I could not shake the feeling that I was being moved around a board without knowing the rules. Every piece of information came wrapped in a threat or a warning, and every warning was followed by silence. That night I checked my door twice, drew the blinds, and set the 2 Cranes on my desk. I turned one over in my hands, tracing the creases, wondering whose fingers had made them. The folds were exact, practiced, like someone had made thousands before. I thought about Takashi's calm at the funeral, the way he had spoken to the detective without asking a single question. People grieve differently, but his grief had been so controlled it felt like it was wearing armor. The next day I went to the funeral home again, claiming I needed to confirm details for an article. The director was polite until I asked if anyone had requested to view the body after the service. He hesitated before saying no, then corrected himself and said yes. A man had come late that evening, after hours. He had the paperwork, so they let him in. I asked what the man looked like. The director said he was nondescript, Asian, middle-aged, polite. I asked if it was Takashi. The director said it could have been, but he was not certain. I asked if anything unusual happened. The director paused again and said the man had insisted on being alone with her for several minutes. When they returned, the director noticed the scent of sandalwood in the room. Walking back to my apartment, I felt the city pressing in. Every sound was sharper. Footsteps behind me that stopped when I stopped. A car that slowed just a little too much as it passed. By the time I reached my door, I was sure someone had been tailing me all day. I locked the door, then placed the cranes inside a drawer, as if hiding them would slow down whatever was coming. I sat in the dark, listening for anything out of place. When my phone buzzed, I almost dropped it. The message was short. They killed her because of what she found. You are in it now. Meet me at midnight, Pier 12. I typed back who is this but got no reply. Midnight at the pier is a cliché in movies, but in reality it smells of salt and diesel and regret. The water slapped against the pilings in a rhythm that made me uneasy. A single figure waited at the end, barely visible in the dim light. It was Takashi. He stood with his hands in his pockets, as if he were waiting for a bus. When I reached him, he said we had to talk, and that talk would begin with the truth about Elena. He said she had been working against people most would never believe existed. He said those people now thought I had something they wanted. I asked what that something was. He said it was called the Ledger. I said I had never heard of it. He said they would not believe me, and that meant I was already a target. The warehouse smelled faintly of tea and machine oil when Takashi told me to follow him. Morning light crept through the grimy windows in pale stripes that looked like prison bars across the floor. I had slept in bursts, dreams bleeding into the sound of his soft footsteps pacing the room while he spoke in Japanese to someone I could not see. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what the next 12 hours would require. I, on the other hand, still had the taste of adrenaline in my mouth and the fog of someone who has been dragged into a game they do not understand but knows they can no longer leave. He handed me a change of clothes without looking directly at me. Dark pants, long-sleeved shirt, soft-soled shoes. He said nothing about the fact that my regular shoes squeaked and my jacket could be spotted from orbit. We walked 3 blocks in silence until we reached a narrow metal door hidden between a discount electronics shop and a store that sold nothing but incense. Takashi knocked once, waited, then knocked twice more in a pattern that sounded casual but was anything but. The door opened to reveal a man with forearms like tree trunks and an expression carved from granite. He stepped aside without greeting us, and we entered what looked like a forgotten gym. Mats covered the floor, wooden practice weapons lined one wall, and the air held the faint tang of sweat and disinfectant. Takashi said this was where I would learn not to embarrass him. I thought he was joking until the granite man tossed me a bamboo sword and told me to stand straight. What followed was not training in the way movies pretend training works. There was no swelling music, no slow-motion montage. There was the steady correction of posture, the constant reminder to move quietly, the frustrating repetition of strikes and steps until my shoulders burned and my feet ached. Takashi watched without interrupting, his eyes occasionally narrowing when I tripped over my own enthusiasm. When I asked if I was being prepared to fight, he said I was being prepared to survive, and that surviving required not being seen until it was too late for the other person to do anything about it. I told him my natural state was being noticed. He said he was aware, and that was exactly why we were here. Hours later, my arms were shaking and my pride had been gently dismantled when Takashi finally called an end to it. He handed me a towel and a bottle of water, then sat on the edge of the mat as if the session had cost him nothing. He said we had work to do tonight. A contact of his had confirmed that the ledger was being kept in the vault of a place called the Tiger's Den, a casino that doubled as a front for the Black Lotus's money laundering operations. He said walking in during business hours would be suicide, but walking in after closing required precision and quiet, which was why I had just spent the morning learning how to step without sounding like a parade. By the time night fell, we were parked across the street from the Tiger's Den. The building was dressed like any high-end gambling hall, all gold trim and tinted windows, but the security cameras that followed our car as we circled the block were not decoration. Takashi wore black from head to toe, his movements somehow smaller without losing any of their presence. He handed me a small earpiece and told me to listen more than I talked. The plan was simple on paper. Slip in through a side entrance he knew, avoid the main floor, reach the office where the vault was located, and leave before anyone realized we had been there. Simple, of course, is a word people use right before everything goes wrong. We moved through the alley behind the casino, where the smell of garbage barely hid the sharper scent of bleach from the previous night's cleaning. Takashi found the side door locked with a keypad, tapped in a sequence without hesitation, and opened it just wide enough for us to slip through. Inside, the hum of refrigeration units and the faint buzz of overhead lights filled the silence. We were in a storage corridor lined with crates of liquor and boxes of branded poker chips. Takashi led the way, pausing at each corner to listen before moving. My heart tried to drum its way out of my chest. I thought about the men in my apartment, and how easily they had tied me up. I thought about how little I wanted to meet their colleagues. We reached the office without being seen, a large room with a desk in the center and a door to the vault at the back. Takashi went to work on the lock with a small kit he produced from his pocket, his hands steady and unhurried. I stood by the door, listening for footsteps. That was when I saw movement in the reflection of a glass cabinet. A figure was behind me, moving fast. I started to shout a warning, but the figure stepped into the light and I froze. It was Miyu. She smiled in a way that made me think of a cat finding the mouse exactly where it expected. She asked what I was doing there. I told her we were looking for something. She said she already knew what. Takashi turned his head just enough to see her, and the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Miyu stepped closer, her hands loose at her sides. She told Takashi the Black Lotus had been expecting him since the night Elena died. She said Elena's death had not been about her betrayal, but about pulling him out of whatever shadow he had been hiding in. Takashi's jaw tightened. Miyu said the ledger had been bait from the start, and that bringing me along had made me the perfect distraction. Before I could ask what that meant, a voice shouted from the hallway, and suddenly the office was filling with people who had no interest in conversation. The next moments blurred into a series of movements I could barely follow. Takashi met the first two with a speed that made them stumble into each other. Miyu was gone before I realized she had moved, leaving the door wide open behind her. Takashi shoved the ledger into my hands without looking at me and told me to run. I did, my legs obeying faster than my brain could process. I tore down the hallway, ducking into the storage corridor, my breath loud in my ears. Behind me, the sounds of fighting echoed, sharp and brief. I pushed through the side door into the alley, clutching the ledger to my chest like a lifeline. I made it 2 blocks before a black car screeched to a stop in front of me. The door opened and Takashi stepped out, unscathed but breathing hard. He took the ledger without a word and motioned for me to get in. Once inside, he said we were not going back to the warehouse. He said too many people now knew I was involved, and that meant the game had changed. He drove in silence for a while, the city lights sliding across his face. Finally, he said we had until morning to figure out our next move, because the Black Lotus would not rest until the ledger was back in their hands. I wanted to ask if Miyu was one of them, but I already knew the answer. We ended up in a safe house that looked like a regular apartment from the outside but had reinforced locks and windows that would not open without a key. Takashi set the ledger on the table and began going through it, page by page, his eyes scanning the columns of names and numbers. I stood by the window, staring at the city. The safe house was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. Takashi sat at the table, his hands steady as he moved through the ledger like a man reading a language only he fully understood. I stood leaning against the wall, arms folded, trying to pretend I was not waiting for him to say something that might change the direction of my life again. Outside, the city hummed in its usual restless way, but in that small room time felt slower, heavier. Takashi finally closed the book, letting it rest under his palms for a moment, as if he was weighing not just the paper but the consequences. He said the ledger confirmed what he had suspected for months, that the Black Lotus had expanded beyond gambling and smuggling into contracts that reached into politics, law enforcement, and corporate boardrooms. He said some of the names in it were untouchable in the eyes of the law, which meant removing them would require methods that did not involve the law at all. I asked what that meant for us. He said it meant the ledger was not enough on its own, that they would call it a forgery if it came out without additional proof. He said it meant we needed to find someone who could tie the names in the book to actions in the real world. I asked if that person existed. He said they did, and they were in the tiger's den when we were there. My stomach dropped when I realized he was talking about Miyu. I told him she had already betrayed us. He said betrayal is a matter of timing, that sometimes the same person could save you one day and sell you out the next. He said finding her was our best chance. The plan was simple enough in theory. We knew Miyu liked to operate from places where she could vanish quickly, and that she favored locations with multiple exits. Takashi had a list of such places, scattered across the city. We would visit them one by one until we found her. He said I was coming because she might not run from me the way she would from him. I did not point out that she might shoot me instead, because I could tell he already knew that, and had decided it was a risk worth taking. We left the safe house just before dawn, moving through streets that were still stretching awake. The air had the sharp chill of early morning, and every step felt like walking towards something I did not want to see. The first two locations were empty, save for a few early risers who gave us cursory glances before returning to their business. The third was a tea house tucked behind an old cinema. The front was closed, but the back door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of jasmine and something faintly metallic. Takashi motioned for me to stay near the door while he moved quietly between the tables. He found her in a corner booth, sitting with her legs crossed and a cup of tea in front of her. She smiled when she saw me, as if we had met by chance and were about to have a friendly chat. Takashi sat across from her without a word. I slid into the seat beside him. Miyu did not seem afraid, but she was not relaxed either. She said she had known we would come eventually, that she was surprised it had taken this long. Takashi asked her if she had the proof to match the names in the ledger. She said she did, but it came with a price. He asked what kind of price. She said safe passage out of the city and enough money to disappear for good. Takashi said she would have those things if she handed it over. She laughed, not in a mocking way, but in a way that said she knew too much to believe promises. She said the proof was stored in a secure location that only she could access, and that she would take us there herself. We left the tea house through the back alley, following Miyu through a maze of narrow streets. Takashi kept a half step behind her, his eyes scanning the rooftops and doorways as we moved. She led us to an old warehouse by the docks, its windows boarded and its exterior marked with graffiti. Inside, the space was dim and smelled of salt water and rust. She pointed to a metal locker near the far wall and told us the drive we needed was inside. Takashi moved forward cautiously, opening the locker with a quick twist of the lock. He pulled out a small metal case and opened it to reveal a flash drive wrapped in cloth. Miyu said it contained video and audio recordings of transactions and meetings, enough to bring down half the names in the ledger. Before we could leave, the sound of engines outside broke the moment. Takashi's expression shifted, and he told me to take the drive and move toward the side exit. He pushed Miyu ahead of him, his voice low but firm. We had just reached the door when it burst open, and half a dozen men flooded in, their movements sharp and practiced. The first one swung a baton toward Takashi, who caught it and twisted, sending the man sprawling. Miyu ducked behind a crate, while I scrambled for cover, clutching the drive. The fight was fast and brutal, a blur of strikes, blocks, and the sound of bodies hitting the floor. Takashi moved like water, flowing between opponents, his strikes precise and final. One of the men broke away from the fight and came toward me. I tried to back away, but the wall stopped me. He grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully until I almost dropped the drive. Before I could react, Miyu appeared behind him, a length of chain in her hands. She looped it around his neck and pulled him back with a strength I would not have believed if I had not seen it. Takashi finished with the last man and told us to move. We ran out into the daylight, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. We did not stop running until we were 3 blocks away. Takashi took the drive from me and slipped it into his jacket. Miyu said that was everything she had and that she was holding him to his promise. Takashi nodded but said she would not be leaving just yet. He said the Black Lotus would be hunting all of us now, and that our only chance was to hit them before they regrouped. Miyu looked like she wanted to argue but decided against it. I asked what the plan was. Takashi said the proof on the drive and the ledger together could end the Black Lotus, but we would need to deliver them to someone who could use them without getting us killed in the process. The sun was high by the time we reached another safe house, this one in a building that looked abandoned from the outside. Takashi spread the ledger and the drive on the table, studying them like pieces of a puzzle. He said the next step was the most dangerous yet. The Black Lotus would know we had the proof, and they would come for it. He said we would use that, draw them out, and finish this. I asked how. He said we would let them think we were meeting someone important to hand over the ledger. He said they would come armed, expecting a trap, and that was when we would take them apart. Miyu asked who the meeting would be with. Takashi said it would be with the one person the Black Lotus feared more than anyone else, a person whose name was in the ledger, but whose loyalty had always been in question. He did not tell us who that was, not yet. Instead, he poured tea for the 3 of us and said we had until nightfall to rest. The quiet in the room felt heavy, each of us knowing that whatever came next would decide whether we walked away from this or became another set of names whispered about in back alleys. Takashi drank his tea in silence, his eyes distant. Night fell like a curtain that knew its cue. The safe house breathed in the quiet way of buildings that had learned patience, the ledger and the drive sitting between us like a pair of sleeping animals we did not want to wake too soon. Takashi outlined the plan with the same calm he brought to boiling water. We would stage a handoff at the freight yard by the river, the one with the skeletal cranes and the narrow catwalk that made everything feel precarious. We would leak the location through a channel he knew the Black Lotus watched. They would arrive armed and suspicious. Waiting for them would be the one person in this city they were afraid to meet in daylight. It was not a politician or a billionaire. It was the detective with the bark haircut who had looked at Elena like she was a puzzle he already knew the edges of. He had been Elena's handler in a task force so secret it had no official name and no budget line, a ghost unit stitched together from favors and the stubbornness of people who wanted corruption to know it could not buy everything. They feared him because he collected quiet debts and paid them back in daylight. We reached the yard an hour before midnight. The river moved slow and black under a sky that seemed to keep its distance. Freight cars sat couched in shadow, the rails whispering heat from the day. The detective waited near the office, hands in his coat pockets, hair freshly disciplined by a barber's chair. He nodded at Takashi and at me like he had never met either of us, and then let his eyes rest on the case that held the ledger and drive. He said we were on the edge of something that would break a few pieces of the city, that none of us would come out clean, that the difference between a noble story and a messy one is usually who writes it first. He was not there for poetry. He was there with 2 unmarked vans tucked behind the warehouse and a handful of agents who had learned how to be invisible in their own homes. The first car came in with its lights off. The second kept distance, as if the driver believed that prudence was a kind of armor. Men emerged and fanned out with the quiet discipline that comes from drilling fear into bones. They wore suits that pretended to be ordinary. They moved like they had rehearsed the end of the world in a gym. The one in front walked with a certainty that told me his orders were never questioned twice. He carried the kind of smile leaders save for weddings and funerals. He introduced himself as Sato, and said he had come for what belonged to him. Takashi said nothing. The detective said the city record would have a strong opinion about ownership in the morning. Sato laughed like someone unwrapping a gift he did not believe was for him. He said Elena had been a lesson and that we were slow students. I had expected the first gunshot to come from a rooftop. Instead, it came from the catwalk above us, where a figure stepped out just long enough to open the night with a single crack. For a heartbeat, the yard froze, startled by the rude sound of reality arriving. Then everything moved at once. The agents from the vans broke cover, the Lotus men lifted weapons from beneath their jackets, and the detective's voice cut through the chaos with instructions that sounded like weather advisories. Takashi was already in motion, pulling me toward the shadow of a stacked crate. Bullets found the metal with an unpleasant insistence. The freight yard gave back a choir of ricochets. Somewhere a man shouted a name that did not belong here. The river kept moving. This was not the clean geometry of the office fight or the brisk physics of the casino corridor. This was a knot of moving parts and bad choices. Takashi flowed through it, turning angles into exits, using the geometry of fear against the men who brought it. He had no gun in his hands because he was the kind of man who could make a small space large enough to do what he wanted. I watched him turn a wrist and a weapon went clattering, watched him step past momentum and let it go where it wanted without him. Still, there were many of them and only a few of us, and math has a way of insisting on itself. Sato did not bother with personal bravery. He hung back, directing with a lift of his hand, letting other men bleed to maintain his posture. He watched Takashi with a kind of distant appreciation, like a fan pleased that the show had sold out. When Takashi carved his way close enough, Sato stepped forward with a blade that flashed once, and then refused to be seen. They circled each other on the edge of the loading bay, the river breathing up at their feet, the dock lights sketching long thin shadows that looked ready to cut on their own. Sato spoke in a voice that did not belong to a back alley. He said Elena refused the last order, and that refusal is a contagion that must be burned out. He said the order had been simple. She was to end the ghost she had married. The words landed even as steel touched steel, with the cold sound of two truths disagreeing. I saw it on Takashi's face, a ripple underwater, the kind of hurt that does not announce itself and never forgives. He stepped in and Sato met him, and the two of them made shapes that had been taught in rooms where the doors had one-way locks. It was not elaborate. It was close and economical and final in intent. The detective moved to give them space with the bored professionalism of a man who had been near too many endings. He shouted for teams to push left, for someone to pin the second car. He did not look away when blades dragged small bright lines through the night. I would like to say I did something bold because I am secretly brave. What I did was clumsy and necessary. One of Sato's men had found the case. He ran with it along the catwalk, boots ringing, heading for the gap where a fence did us the favor of pretending to be a boundary. I chased even though my lungs had made other plans. Halfway up the stairs, my foot missed a rung and I met a railing with my ribs. The man turned, gun rising, and I had the sudden clear thought that perhaps journalism should pay better hazard bonuses. I swung the only thing in reach, which turned out to be the heavy metal hook from a hoist chain, and for once physics took pity on me. The hook caught his wrist, his aim ragged the night, and the case slid to the edge of the catwalk where it paused as if considering a plunge. I threw myself forward, caught the handle with both hands, and hung there for a full second wondering if this was how a sensible person dies. Below, the fight at the loading bay tipped from balance into decision. Takashi turned Sato's wrist with a movement so small it made no sense until the blade was in a different hand. Sato stepped back, misjudged the heel of the dock, and found nothing under him but the river's opinion. Takashi could have let gravity finish the sentence. He did not. He caught Sato's sleeve, pulled him back to the boards, and let him feel the mercy for exactly as long as it took to put him on the ground and take the blade away forever. The detective arrived with two agents, cuffs appeared from a pocket that had been waiting for this moment all month, and the night exhaled in a rough whisper.